Renovation Nation is a popular television programme, but there are two sides to renovation. In fact, there are two kinds of renovation. Nobody would object to people in these difficult circumstances who often have children living with them because they cannot afford to get onto the property market, and this is essentially a London problem. What happens in the central 6 boroughs of London does not happen in the rest of the country. But what happens there is very different and very, very unpleasant for those who are near to major renovation works. Near Baker Street Tube Station, the residents of one block had to endure 2 years of impossible levels of noise while the building next to them was stripped down to steel girders and rebuilt from bottom to top, and there was apparently nothing they nor anyone else could do about it. The noise apparently was completely unbearable. I'm talking about the use of percussive drills, the kind that are used on open sites, and sometimes they are used in blocks where people are still living. I don't live in central London, I'm very glad to say, but the poet Brenda Williams does. She's lived there on a block in London's famous Abbey Road for nearly 30 years, and the quality of her life and the quality of many people's lives in the 6 central boroughs of London has hugely deteriorated as property developers. This is the key term, property developers. What property developers are basically people who are already incredibly rich and want to become even richer. And what is happening is that they are acquiring, quite legally, blocks of flats, or in some cases half a block of flats, and they are tearing the flats apart. They are bearing them down to the joists. They are rebuilding them from the inside, and this is not a process that can be done in days or weeks, sometimes not even months. The block I'm referring to used to be called Old Manor Court, and in an attempt to poshify it, the block leaseholder, Bruce Ritchie, who is a sole owner of 162 companies, principally residential land, acquired this block when a previous owner became bankrupt some 7 years ago. He bought it from the official receiver, I believe, or from someone who was about to go into receivership. And since that time, he owns about 2/3 of the flats in the block, and he has been trying to renovate the flats so that they can be sold for somewhere between £1 and £1.5 million each. These renovations began in 2007. He did further renovations between 2010 and 2011. Then the renovations stopped and he began again this year. The sums of money involved in this kind of renovation are huge. There is very little information on the internet about Mr. Ritchie. He did give an interview to Property Weekly a few years ago, which was viewable online but now cannot be viewed unless you have a subscription. But I did see it and I did print it off. And apparently, some years ago, Mr. Ritchie entered into an agreement, a perfectly legal agreement of course, with the Bank of Scotland, and the sum was the incredible sum of £1 billion. And the agreement was that Mr. Ritchie acquired, improved and prepared to sell on properties in central London to this value, and in the interview with Property Weekly, Mr. Ritchie was credited with owning a yacht called the Mirabelle in the south of France, and being a part owner or the owner of a series of nightclubs, very successful and profitable nightclubs in London, and he was hailed as being a hugely successful entrepreneur. This is all very well, no doubt, for Mr. Ritchie, but not for those poor residents of Old Manor Court, now renamed Manor Apartments. The second stage of the renovation, which stopped in 2011, began again on April the 8th of this year, and means that those people living in the block, about half the flats, are being daily subjected to slab drilling. Westminster Council have responded to this crisis by putting a Section 61 notice on the block, which restricts heavy percussive slab drilling to 6 hours a day and leaves those left in residence with 4 hours of work, but not to the level of the impossible noise of slab drilling. In reality, this means that life is very difficult to lead for those people. This does not just apply to people in flats. People who live in nearby houses say that houses near to them have had the same work. There is one house on Marlborough Place, which is just round the corner, which has been undergoing renovation on and off for a number of years. Apparently the owners of that house run out of money, they leave it for a year, then further renovation work is done. And there is no answer in legislation as it stands to this. There needs to be changes in the law. The renovation of a single property, once it's done, should not be allowed to be renovated again for a decade. This seems basic common sense. There needs to be much further, deeper, more powerful legislation about renovation. I'm not talking about somebody adding a room to a 3-bedroom semi. I'm not talking about these kind of things. I'm talking about people with millions of pounds wanting to enrich themselves and make themselves even richer, and those who are unfortunate enough to live within hearing distance are daily subjected to the blasting non-stop of percussive drills which are really suited only to external building sites. A lot more legislation is needed here. Unfortunately, the policy of the present government is to take away what they call red tape. Red tape actually is very effective. It stops the greedy from becoming even richer, and it provides some protection for those who are unfortunate enough to live within hearing distance of these dreadful works in progress. The outcome is very dubious. Recently, huge blocks of new flats were built near what used to be Battersea Power Station, and according to the reports in the press, most of them were sold to the Arabic parts of the world before they were even offered in the European market, having been bought to stand empty as long-standing financial property investments. Some people would say this is a good thing, but who is it good for? Not for the people of London, who are desperately short of accommodation. Very good for the people who are already incredibly wealthy and who are simply buying up properties. This has nothing to do with culture, with race, with religion. It is simply the way unfettered capitalism works, which is something which, for the poor, for the weak, for the vulnerable, is absolutely dreadful. It is said that 500,000 people in the UK now could not survive without access to food banks. What kind of society do we live in? At 71, I know what kind of society we used to live in. I grew up in the 1940s and the 50s and the 60s when these kind of things simply didn't happen. When Brenda Williams, who is a most excellent poet, moved into Manor Apartments 30 years ago, the block was quiet and civilised. It wasn't being renovated, nor was any property nearby being renovated. In fact, I don't think the word renovation was part of our everyday vocabulary. But now, wherever you go in central London, particularly in the 6 central boroughs, renovation is proceeding, it's being repeated, it's being redone, it's being undone, and it's being redone again. Flats in Brenda's block, since 2007, the same flats have been actually renovated 3 times. What is the point of this kind of renovation? Of course, the answer is very simple. It's to make money for the block leaseholder, Mr. Ritchie, who is very, very rich. And this is to make him, of course, even more money. The flats are, it's a very small block, 24 flats. When Brenda moved in, there used to be a caretaker's flat, but of course, eventually his services were dispensed with and the flat simply became another flat to be bought and sold on the market. And it is very tragic because blocks are like this. The regulation of them, the management of them is very complex. Most blocks are now actually run by the people who live in them, because once the actual owner occupancy reaches 60% by law, the management of the block is turned over to a committee formed by those people who live there, and they arrange for the works to be done that are necessary. But the situation of people like Brenda and other vulnerable people, mainly of course the elderly and the vulnerable, often people who live alone, is very, very difficult. What can an ordinary person do to not prevent but to regulate what is ongoing? Councils can be very helpful, and in Brenda's case have been extremely helpful, but there are limits to their statutory powers. These statutory powers need to be hugely increased. Renovation should not go on again and again and again. It needs to be regulated, and the rich need to be taxed, and renovation itself should be subject to tax, because if you renovate a property and you double and treble its value, then that should be taxed in some way, through capital gains tax perhaps. I don't know how this could be done, but there are ways to tax the rich, and these taxes need to be put in, and restraints need to be made, and the vulnerable and those who are in this situation need to be protected by the law, and those who are responsible, the rich, need to be regulated, they need to be held back, they need to be told 1 renovation is acceptable, 2 and 3 are most certainly not.